Okay, so sorry about that. That was my fault. But I just want to start by saying that I think the really interesting science that's going on these days. I think the really interesting science that's going on these days is really happening at interfaces. So whether that be a multidisciplinary kind of thing, or multiple techniques, or even multiple scales, you have to have a really unique perspective to tackle the scientific problems that are going on today. And I think people really function at this level too. A lot of them have different interests. So I think as graduate students, if you're doing one of these projects and you're interested in the science that is happening at these interfaces, I think you have a really unique ability to reach out to these people. So if you have interests in music, or education, or policy, or politics, or economics, I think you absolutely should use those abilities and really create some unique outreach opportunities. So just to briefly start off, I'm not going to tell you much about these programs, but I want to highlight the fact that there's some similarities in some of the outreach programs that I've done. These two here on the top are both high school geared programs, and they feed one into the other. So this first one, the GK-12 Fellowship, this is a very structured and supportive environment. So yesterday we talked about kind of creating your own outreach or a broader impacts identity. And this was a very receptive environment to do that for me. So if you ever have a chance to do a program like this through your university or through a national organization, I encourage you to do that because it will be transformative. And then the neat thing that happened with this program is that the modules that we created for these classrooms, I could easily adapt those to one-day events. So Excite is a summer workshop we do through one of the diversity offices on campus, and it's geared at grades 9 through 12 for girls who are interested in STEM. So we simply took concepts that we had done in the classroom here and adapted them to 3-hour workshops. And the nice thing about both of these programs is that once I'm gone, hopefully I graduate in the near future, these can be implemented both in the classroom and in the workshops, and these are things that they can already implement on their own, and they'll extend past my time at K-State. So these bottom two experiences are both geared at the elementary school, and this is something I kind of fell into. I didn't necessarily think it would be a good idea to take my research, which is working on the concept of muscle development using fruit flies. I thought that is going to be hard to take into an elementary classroom. And I got approached by a representative from our 4-H office, and I had the misconception that 4-H does not do things outside of agriculture, and that was my fault. 4-H then told me about this really great program they have called SPIN, or Special Interest Groups, which are after-school programs, and you can do one on anything you want. They do programs on robotics, on model organisms, on engineering, and so I was able to adapt the model that we use and take that into the classroom and teach these students about why we use model organisms in research and what it can tell us about the health of humans. So similarly, this was kind of a test ground for me to try out some activities to then expand into a full-day science day. And we received money from the American Society for Cell Biology to do this, and we approached this from a very inquiry-heavy standpoint. So we wanted the students to be able to approach a station with some sort of concept about cellular biology and have them make kind of age-appropriate observations. So obviously the kindergartners were not going to make as detailed explanations as the 5th graders, but we created these stations so that everybody had a chance to kind of engage in the scientific process. And we did things with dance and with music, and we incorporated kind of more game PE aspects. So if anybody wants to talk about these later, come find me. But this is some of the things that I've done. But what I really want to tell, especially to the graduate students in the room, is that by engaging in these kind of outreach experiences, you're actually bettering yourself. It really is a graduate training experience. And that's the way that NSF will market GK-12 typically, is as a graduate training experience. And this is because you not only have to go into the classroom and talk to somebody and teach them about a concept, but you have to be extremely knowledgeable kids actually ask very insightful questions. You have to be on top of your game, and you have to have the skills, you have to be able to coach them and develop them, and while you're doing all these things, those concepts are also being applied to your education. And I would definitely say that I've learned just as much by being in the classroom than I have it being at the bench. So one thing that you will have to remember though, especially if you're working in the K-12 classroom, you really have to meet students where they are, because even within a particular grade level, there's a wide spectrum of people. So you have to be very careful about your language that you use. You know, some people might not even know what a cell is, so describing that concept, you really have to break everything down into the simplest way possible. And if you've ever done the 10,000 word challenge, it's the idea that you can only use the 10,000 most common words in the English language. Muscle is not even on that list of words. So if you try to break it down to that level, you'll be a more effective communicator for sure. So if you're thinking about engaging in some sort of outreach experience as a graduate student, or you're kind of creating this novel program, it can seem pretty ominous. And when you start to plan, you kind of get this list of questions that pop into your head. It's mostly logistical at first, and then kind of like the doubt sets in of, can I do this? You know, what if they get out of hand in the classroom? What if I'm not engaging? But it'll be okay, because you're not going to be alone. You're going to have quite a bit of help. I would say don't do it on your own. That's a terrible idea. And I think it's important to be realistic when you go into these rooms. You're not going to do everything right the first time. You can plan all day long and everything will not go correctly, and sometimes that's better. Sometimes it actually ends up being better the way that things go. And you will get better at time engaging the students' interest levels and their ability levels, and you will create better activities over time. But I think the biggest thing that I really enjoyed about the outreach is that when you walk into the classroom, you've already succeeded on some level, because those kids have probably never met a scientist. And even if we're only scientists in trainings officially, I think there's a statistic that only 18% of Americans actually know a scientist. So imagine if you're going into the classroom and you can bring that number up just a little bit. That translates pretty much directly, those personal connections, into better trust of science and better scientific literacy overall. So a couple words of advice, I guess, for the rest of the time is to really find your niche. So I think people try to struggle and try to come up with these really good ideas, but just use who you are. And in Kansas, I think everybody thinks there's not good science going on in Kansas. Nobody wants to hear about science in Kansas, and that's not been my experience at all. Actually, I'm from Illinois, and the school systems here in Kansas that I've been into are much better than the rural school district that I was in. So I think utilize all the resources they have, because many of them have a lot of resources for science curriculum. And as we've been talking about with the next generation science standards, there's a lot of need for these new inquiry-based labs, and the teachers are really hungry for these opportunities that you can bring them. And as a graduate student, you're intimately familiar with what it's like to be in the lab, so I think we have a unique perspective to offer. So especially important if you're thinking about doing a multi-day activity, or you're kind of consistently going into the classroom, is just pick a message and stick to it. So for me, I tend to advocate for model organism research and basic research. But this could be anything. This could even be something so simple as seeing scientists as people, not as these foreign concepts in a lab. So make sure that you really hit that message over and over. Also, just like you were probably really careful when you picked your advisor, be careful when you pick your collaborator. They should complement you in your personality and your goals. And I think you'll see that they are experts in the classroom, so use their expertise and really create a fusion of your ideas, because it will be a better activity for it. I think a lot of times teachers don't get the credit they deserve for what they do, and I think I had one of the best teachers that I've ever had as a collaborator. So how do you do this? If you're thinking about doing some sort of outreach portfolio, like you want to do an extended program, I would say mix kind of these sustained interactions with short-term interactions. So campus groups are obviously a really great place to start. They have access to the school districts and to different community groups. So these are some of the ones that we have at K-State. So research and extension, 4-H have mentioned. The cause office is kind of our women in STEM group. And if you're in the health field, there's often like advocacy groups for public outreach that are really great to take advantage of. Obviously, local school districts are great, but how do you make that connection? In my experience, they're extremely welcoming. So I'd say go to an event and meet someone or reach out. Just as long as you reach out, I think you're going to see that they appreciate volunteers coming into their school. And then one that I've kind of taken advantage of more recently are scientific societies. So I mentioned the American Society for Cell Biology. They actually are starting to provide funding and different events, so I would tap into them for some resources. So as we've been talking about, learning happens best through these hands-on activities. So I think you need to plan in for your activities, moments for them to just kind of explore. So we just hand them the bottles of flies and let them observe, and that's typically when the really interesting things happen. And with this, let a little bit of spontaneous science happen. Not so much that it can get out of hand, create a structure, but leave some breathing time for the students to really play science and be immersed in it. And then one area that we've really used are using these ideas of familiar things. So we use art really heavily with our science. We have images of the muscles themselves. But don't forget things like dance and music and sports, whatever works to communicate your message. And don't simply recreate, or I guess don't try to recreate the wheel every time you do a new activity. We do the same activity basically at all levels, incorporating more and more complex science. So with the high schoolers, we tend to integrate imaging software for a lot of our activities. So I guess the idea is that if you really get involved in this, you can kind of become your local expert at outreach as a graduate student, which is fun because often we are not experts at anything. But make sure you don't overcommit or kind of be redundant, be strategic in these plannings. And remember that graduation is always your #1 priority, so don't upset your boss and get too involved with this. So here are some people that I'd like to acknowledge, and I'd just like to say to the graduate students that if your university is not requiring you to do outreach, you should really require it of yourself because it will make you a better scientist.